corporate responsibility in supply chain with Carl Icahn, McDonald's, and the Pigs. Employees have voted with their voices and with their feet on the importance of issues impacting them directly and on concerns that they notice in the social sphere. Competition has changed dramatically with unprecedented speed through technology, M&A, and innovation. And data, cybersecurity, AI, and supply chain now appear on board matrices as companies revisit their strategies and risk. We have with us three experts who understand what this means for CEOs and boards and how forward-looking companies are responding to this. The first is Ryan Krause. Ryan is a preeminent researcher of board topics. Today, we're focusing on his research on the varied impact on company performance when particular skills are recruited for board roles. Ryan has received much recognition here at Neely, including the Emerging Scholar Award. Ryan is the Robert and Edith Schumacher Jr. Faculty Fellow in Entrepreneurship and Innovation. His thought leadership has been featured in numerous scholarly journals and leading business publications, including the Harvard Business Review. Ryan knows the inside of the boardroom as well, as he's the board chair of the Fort Worth Opera. We also have Maribess Miller. Maribess had a distinguished career with PwC, where she served as the North Texas managing partner. She also held regional and national leadership positions in healthcare, consumer, industrial products, and services. After retiring from PwC, Maribess was appointed to the Texas State Board of Public Accountancy, where she served on the Rules and Executive Committees and chaired the Behavioral Enforcement Committee. Maribess's governance career shows a similar breadth and depth, as did her corporate career. She currently chairs the Nominating and Governance Committee at D.R. Horton, which is traded on the New York Stock Exchange. She also serves on the Audit and Compensation Committees for that company. She serves on the board of the NASDAQ-traded Triumph Bancorp, where she also chairs the Nominating and Governance Committee and serves on the Audit Committee. She was a board director and chaired the audit committee for Zix Corporation, which was a public company that was traded on the NASDAQ and was sold to OpenText in January of this year. She chairs the audit committee and serves on the compensation committee for Midmark, which is a private company. Maribess's prior service includes the advisory committee for the Texas Women's Venture Fund, the audit committee chair for the Dallas Symphony Orchestra, and the business board here at Neely. Maribess, it makes us all proud at TCU, as she's a cum laude graduate of TCU in accounting. Another TCU success story is Michael Peregrine. After having earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from TCU, Michael went on to Northwestern University, where he earned his Doctor of Law degree. Michael is a partner with McDermott, Will, and Emery, and is recognized as one of the leading national practitioners in corporate governance law. You'll see Michael's governance expertise regularly guiding us electronically in both Forbes and the Harvard Corporate Governance Forum. Michael represents corporations, officers, and directors in matters of corporate structure, corporate alliance, officer director liability, fiduciary duties, and charitable trust law. Michael has received numerous awards, including multiple appearances on the U.S. Legal 500 list, the Best Lawyers in America, BTI Client Service All-Star, Chambers USA, and Michael is a fellow of the American Health Lawyers Association. Thank you to Ryan and Maribess and Michael for sharing your insights on dangers in the boardroom with TCU's alumni, friends, and students. One of the ways in which boards are evolving to meet the pace and scope of demands is through diversifying their functional makeup. Spencer Stewart calls all other any corporate executive who's not a current or retired CEO, COO, president, board chair, or financial executive. And this all other category has grown 57% in the last 10 years. In 2021, all other directors made up 33% of US directors. With the rise of online and omni-channel marketing and digital customer interactions, marketing and commercial are a couple of those areas where we've seen rise in the functional importance of board service. Brian, you've written about the impact that marketing executives have on corporate boards. What were your findings?
So yeah, thanks, Bets. So I've done a study on marketing executives. I've done a study on operations executives. I'm working on something right now that's not published on IT executives on board. So this has been an area of interest of mine, looking at specific kinds of human capital. And the overall finding that we end up with, it's pretty consistent across functions, is that they're all valuable in a particular context. So for example, marketing executives, we looked at the number of people with executive level marketing experience, not just being a brand manager or something like that, but being a CMO or EVP of branding or something like that. And those were having more of those executives on boards, outside executives as serving as independent directors, was very positively associated with outcomes like revenue growth, which makes sense because that's their expertise, is driving growth. It was not associated with profitability. With the operations executives, they were associated with profitability, but only at firms whose operational efficiency has been declining. And so you see this general pattern in data, and this is across usually S&P 1500 firms over several years. We look at these things. And what you generally find is that the benefits of specific kinds of expertise depend on really two kinds of contexts. One is the strategic context of the firm. What is the firm's needs in terms of its operations, its external access to resources, and its industry? That's one type of context that's really important. The other is, what's the internal context on the board? So we often think of like more expertise is better, but oftentimes that is dependent on who else is on the board and how the board is managed. So for example, going back to that marketing study, we found that the impact of marketers on the board was dulled, but the more CFOs there were on the board. So there's a little bit of a difference in terms of how willing is the board to listen to the input of people from different perspectives and things like that. So really keep in mind the fit between that context, the external and internal strategic context, and the internal board context when making those decisions.
Now that's an interesting way of looking at it. And I'm curious, Maribess, you've seen pressures on board leadership to assess management adjustments to some of these new risks and these fast changing markets that we've seen. Ryan talked a little bit about how the importance of functional expertise also depends on who else is sitting on the board. Do you see increased temptation for board directors who've been brought in for their functional expertise to veer beyond their oversight roles and into management's responsibilities?
Yes. First, I have to say that diversity on a board is key, whether it's functional or gender or industry or ethnicity, and the community of investors out there is asking for this. So it's definitely, the pendulum is in that direction. As it relates to how that team, that board functions, yes, when you bring in that specific functional expertise, the tendency is to, focus on that area. So there has to be a balance between that focus on functional. An example, late breaking news, the SEC just put out a proposed rule. And that rule is saying, is about cyber. So that the cyber, and they specifically say, it's really kind of frightening to me as chair of NobGov, but they specifically say that the disclosures would include the director's name and nature of the expertise. They want to know who on the board is responsible for cyber, and that includes whether director has prior work experience in or knowledge of cybersecurity or cyber certification. So I think that's what we're seeing. That rule just came out. Comments are due May 9th. So I would encourage all the directors out there to comment, because I think it's a little dangerous to start assigning specific areas. I mean, it's a board in total. They want to know, do you have a risk committee? Do you have, who is responsible? But I think that is going to be a dangerous path to go down. And considering this is, a first rulemaking by the SEC, I think we ought to all pay attention and make note. But, to your question, board's role is in total to help guide the company for all stakeholders. And that all stakeholders is evolving, not just to mean shareholders, but it's also the community. It's also all the teammates and the workforce. And so that definition is expanding for sure. So regardless of what your personal background is, you have to have the ability to make decisions and govern the big picture.
Thank you. Michael?
Well, I think what we're seeing too is also a little bit of a change or shift in the board, traditional board management dynamic. Directors are learning and being told by their advisors that the expectations of the law and of the corporate constituents are expanding. The directors are expected to be responsible for a far greater larger menu of oversight responsibilities and decision-making responsibilities than ever in the past. So it's going to be natural for them to lean in more on some of the management responsibilities. Management, on the other hand, is probably very happy to get the directors out of their hair after a closer examination during the period of the pandemic. The challenge is that the law expects directors to be at the board and management to be in a partnership with the lowercase p, to work together, to be collegial teammates, so to speak. Board members are expected to be resources to the board, support for the board, and be intelligent enough and skilled enough to respond to management's expectations of, hey, I need help, I need your input, I need your advice. So I think that one of the biggest challenges right now in the boardroom is the effective management of the dynamic. There is no black and white line with respect to where governance ends and management begins. And there's going to be increased pressure as long as directors see themselves being held to a higher scope of responsibility. They're going to want to make sure that they make their mark. Management's got to adjust to it. There has to be a balance, I think, as Maribess was saying.
Actually, you brought up both of you brought up a couple of interesting points between Maribess's mention of cyber and digital and your remarks, Michael, about during the pandemic, the way in which boards have increasingly moved to an all hands on deck approach that went beyond the typical scope of board involvement. Ryan, I think you did a study having to do with the way that boards worked at the start of the pandemic.
We did, yeah. We sort of took the context as an opportunity to survey corporate directors to understand how their boards were being led, particularly by their chairs during the crisis. And that study is kind of working its way through the peer review process right now, hopefully be accepted soon. But basically our key finding was that, there's not a lot of research on the leadership behavior of chairs, but it is a really significant leadership role because chairs don't have a whole lot of structural authority. They have a little bit, but it's mostly about getting this group of people to to provide input and then walk in a straight line after input's been provided and deliberated. And so what we found was that there were different kinds of adaptive leadership behavior in the context of the crisis, depending on who the chair was. And so there was a huge difference. If the chair was the CEO, then they were much better. The company responded to the crisis better and ultimately performed better, i.e. more profitably in 2020, if that person used a very hands-off kind of leadership approach, right? This is a combined CEO chair, encouraging participation from the board, but not being overly directive about how the board should do its work. If the chair was an independent director, it was the exact opposite. The firms got better performance out of an independent chair who exercised a much more directive approach, kind of providing instructions to the board about exactly how they were going to go about their work, interact with the CEO, sort of the process. We found that boards were meeting way more frequently than typical when the crisis broke out. And so, I think that's where that leadership role comes in too, is that, you're starting to have these impromptu meetings, everything's on Zoom. So they're getting together a lot more frequently. And so the key takeaway there is leadership on a board is so important, particularly in a crisis, because you do have this group of people who are collectively responsible for the entire organization, but not individually responsible for anything, which is why I find what Maribess is talking about with the SEC so fascinating. And I'm inclined to agree, a little dangerous, because once you start making people individually responsible for things, you turn them into executives, right? And they're not paid enough to do that. And B, that defeats the entire point of a board, which is they make collective decisions. They vote on things that are official company decisions. Once you can have committees and things like that, but if you start isolating individuals and saying you're responsible for this, you turn them into an executive, and I think that kind of defeats the purpose.
And you raised a couple of interesting things about how board meetings changed at the beginning of the pandemic. I know as we were talking prior to this session, we talked a little bit, Maribess, also about how you'd seen, depending on the size of the company, different kinds of involvement from boards versus management. Is that
right?
Something?
Well, Ryan talked about crisis, and the crisis creates a focus, and it is something everyone can rally around. And so the pandemic, the supply chain issues, focus or shift to technology, cyber incidents, Russia, that had an impact. I mean, people are focused, and I think that creates a better outcome. I mean, it's just no question there are shifts from the traditional qualifications needed, but you have to look at the strategy of the company, and you have to look at backup, like Ryan was saying, look at the big picture to decide what's needed. I'll give you an example. One board I sit on, it's a financial services company, and started out as a community bank, and then we got into payments specifically in transportation. So we wake up one day and we have all bankers, we have generalists on the board, and we find that we need that payments expertise. We need that transportation industry expertise. But at the same time, the institutional investors are saying, hey, you have one woman, you need three. Hey, we want risk management as a focus. We want this function. So all of a sudden you have a whole list of things that you can, as a board, talk about. And so the board concluded, yes, we need that transportation. That's our future. We need that payments expertise. We need someone to chair our risk management committee. And so we really had to have two board members step off. And then we ended up having to have a national search because we needed multiple things from those two board seats. And so we ended up arriving there, and then we wanted the culture to be right. So everyone wanted to interview the candidates. So it's a simultaneous equation, and it's really difficult to navigate through all that, but definitely worth it.
Well, and it's interesting. I think you've highlighted that we need to keep in mind that boards operate collectively, not individually. And so even when functional expertise comes in the room, it needs to be managed throughout the committee structure and throughout the collective responsibility of the board. I'm curious, Michael, because I know you've written quite a lot about the importance of the board's role as a governance vehicle, and how there can be many temptations to veer off of that particular role. Do you see, as companies are returning out of the hyper pandemic focus. Do you see particular areas where you'd highlight as risk that boards need to attend to get back on track with their governance?
Well, I think that's a great question, Bess. And following up on what Maribess said, I think it's important to recognize that you're never going to have enough board seats to address all the areas of expertise that you need on the board. The challenges of a governance and nominating committee are really extraordinary. And I don't think there's been enough discussion about what do you prioritize, diversity, industry expertise, the value of a generalist, which I tend to think is very important. Someone who can sit back and offer the diversity of experience. I'll point out one area, though, that I believe, perhaps because of my own technical limitations, I think is going to be increasingly critical in some industries, and that's in the AI area. The ability of, and again, from my limited perspective, the technical applications of AI can be overwhelming to a board, especially a board with individuals who are not scientifically oriented. And the tendency in that kind of situation is to defer to management. Hey, that's not my area. I can barely dial my phone. I'm not going to get into it. I don't know what you're talking about on these things. And that's, I think, a great danger right now when you find that we have competing, very valuable and very meritorious interests on the hand of those who believe that within an organization that innovation is the absolute key to success and competitive nature. And on the other hand, we have people saying, well, wait a minute, we got to worry about the trustworthiness of the AI applications, the safety, the failures. We don't have a handle on that. The board needs to be an honest broker in this situation. Do you absolutely need AI expertise to be in that situation? It would help, but if you can't get that, you certainly need to have enough experience. I think, Maribess, you made this point. You've got to do your homework. You've got to put yourself in a position where you can exercise that balancing. That, in my mind, is one of the most significant governance challenges that's coming up the road. And I believe, and Ryan, you may be following this as well, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce is supposed to issue a report this fall on where we're going in terms of board oversight of AI. And I think it's something to follow, and maybe, and certainly an area where Neely, I know, will be taking a leadership role.
Did you want to say something on that, Ryan, or I noticed a little nod?
Yeah, just to sort of piggyback on what Maribess and Michael said. It isn't just, so for example, an alternative approach to having somebody with their own AI expertise is the social capital to get that AI expertise, right? So I think, it isn't necessarily that you have to get somebody who individually checks all these boxes, but if you don't have the expertise on the board, it's important to have people on the board who know where to get it and bring it in as consulting to the board. Because I think one of the challenges that boards have is figuring out where that line is, where their responsibility ends and management has to take over. And some boards struggle with getting too involved and trying to take over strategy too much, and other boards struggle with either not having the expertise or not wanting to interfere, and it's kind of a moving target, right? As the where the delineation between oversight and management kind of gets very blurry, as more and more things become governance issues as opposed to sort of discretionary strategic concerns. Things that we used to think were discretionary now become required, and things like that. It becomes this moving target, and so it's a constant challenge. So sometimes having people who are, to Michael's point, more generalist. The more generalist you are, probably the wider your social capital, the wider your network, and you can draw on those connections as well to get the information you need.
Well, I think you actually brought up a couple of things that are interesting and important. One is the board's role actually to ask questions rather than to give answers. And I think, Maribess, that's something that you were alluding to when you first brought up the SEC proposal. And one of the real dangers of having a cyber expert on your board, for instance, is that person's expertise is a point in time, and B, however experienced they are, it's going to be somewhat narrow within that framework. So to the point that both Michael and Ryan are also raising, there's tremendous benefit to the board knowing how to ask those questions and knowing to whom they can ask those questions. It's interesting. I had also spoken with a venture capitalist who works exclusively in the healthcare AI space. And one of the things that he said was that one of the benefits of working in healthcare AI, as opposed to in a different industry, is that the fast speed of technology advancement is offset by the regulation. And I thought that was a really interesting way to think about it, whether you're thinking about data privacy or whether you're thinking about bias in the algorithms, to think about what kind of offsetting risks you might have on the board. Now, I'm curious because we've touched on a couple of areas, Ryan, of your academic research, and that typically can give us insights in the current environment and offer us some things to do on a going forward basis. One of the areas of expertise that lawyers bring to the table, Michael, is that they give us the opportunities to highlight real world problems and to interpret them and give us some additional context to prevent or to avoid them. Now, you've written about the significant rise in officer and board level conflicts of interest, Michael. Do you think it becomes more difficult for boards to effectively govern themselves when directors over-index on their functional or industry strengths?
I do, but I also think the real challenge right now, Bets, is for boards to recognize that this is a significant issue and to begin to think about it and focus on it. There's always a natural tendency that we have to gloss over conflicts or to kind of justify conflicts. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of Sarbanes-Oxley, of the events that led to the adoption of Sarbanes in about 4 weeks. And I think it's important to go back and recognize some of the corporate responsibility lessons from that. And part of that is directors kind of forgot who they were working for. Lawyers and accountants forgot who they were working for. Directors basically were over deferential to management. We need to be able in the boardroom to have our head on a swivel. We need to be able, especially as we become very involved, very active, as the company becomes a broad portfolio, to identify biases in areas where their loyalties may be challenged. Doesn't make people bad. It doesn't mean you have to wear a scarlet letter on your lapel. It does mean you have to raise your hand. It does mean you have to say, hey, is this a problem? Because I think Ryan's research demonstrates this, one of the problems is that the courts have been extremely unsympathetic to director conflicts of interest and management conflicts of interest, especially in the transaction sense. And if you want to live in a courtroom in Delaware for the next 5 years of your life, then ignore conflicts, forget about it, gloss them over. But I think the smart play is to sit back and use, for example, the anniversary of Sarbanes to say, what are we supposed to do in these situations? Are we looking at these conflicts? Are we identifying areas where it may arise? And are we putting systems in place so we don't get caught? And if conflicts are damaging, can be destructive to the corporation, destructive to its business strategy, and destructive to a director's reputation.
No, I think that's huge. And actually, I noticed you grinning a little bit there, Maribess. And one of the things I was curious about that you raised a little bit earlier when you talked about how all of the members of your sitting board interviewed all of the candidates for those 2 board seats. It really calls into question not just functional expertise and industry expertise, but also the importance of fit and soft skills. How do you feel like those tie in to today's boardroom?
It's really important because the ability to exercise good judgment over the whole range of topics, most of which are outside of your individual expertise, is critical. It involves, how you ask questions, being collaborative, being able to debate difficult issues without, a my way or the highway kind of approach, being an honest broker that Michael mentioned. I find myself, because I'm chairing NomGov at a couple of boards, defending ESG, the environmental, social governance, disclosures that are unpopular in a lot of boardrooms, but I find myself needing to take that side and put myself in the shoes of institutional investors and those requiring disclosures, requiring all of these changes. And, you know, that's a skill, and being able to sway other people. And I find for me, it's like, okay, I'm better off if I do this one-on-one outside, you know, in different settings. So however it works, you know, you kind of have to start with the end in mind. It's like a family. Everybody has strengths, weaknesses, and you have to draw on all those skills and have courage of conviction. And, you know, the pressure's mounting to be all to everyone. And so sometimes you do have to put a stake in the ground, but it requires some good, healthy debate, which is a soft skill, right?
Yes. No, oh, no, for sure. Now, I'm curious, Ryan, we talked a little bit earlier about the board directors themselves and what kind of functional skills they bring and how that shapes the success of a board and the success of a company. What do you think about the board directors who are former CEOs, and how do you compare those with in terms of their role in the boardroom? Because I'm thinking about the influence skills that Mary.
Yeah, so it's you know, it's good. There's a lot of human and social capital that comes with former CEOs, and I think that's and understanding of what it takes to run an entire organization, which is why I think a lot of CEOs want former CEOs on their board. There's a lot of understanding there, but there's risks too, in that, again, not to be a broken record, but the board is a collective decision maker, and their job is to engage in oversight and advice giving, but not to run the organization. And sometimes when you have former CEOs, they're used to being the boss. They're used to making those decisions. So that can be a somewhat difficult transition into being one of many, one of 10 people who are more or less all, kind of on the same level, and you get input, but not, you don't get to be the decision maker. And, to Maribess's point, there are some people who come to a board with the skills necessary to know how to influence people. And then there are some people who come to a board expecting to make decisions. And I think it's the people who have that expertise in influence that are able to actually get a lot more done. And, because it is much more about that. And I think that, now being a board chair, I am routinely trying to find better ways to get people to, work together in a real, collaborate in a really productive way that gets you to a better outcome and leverages everybody's expertise without it devolving into kind of a cacophonous, everyone just sort of unloading into the room. When I figure out how to do that, I will write my book and be able to provide a lot more insight. But yeah, yeah.
Help. So one of my board chairs has a whiteboard, and they put this whiteboard up, and at the end of the meeting, if someone gets off tangent, one of the functional conversation goes too long, you as a board chair have to deal with, only have so much time, right? So use that whiteboard to put it up in the parking lot, and then that serves as a way to come back at it later in smaller groups too. So idea.
Well, yeah, and I think actually you talked about a couple of things that are important that when we were prepping to come on here, we talked about. And then one was this concept of functional fluency, right? How can you understand enough about the different functions that you can make the important decisions that they need to make, that you can ask for the right kind of information. And I'm really curious on what thoughts you all have on how we can do that effectively on boards without getting into groupthink, right? Because the other side of the coin of judgment and influence is everybody sits around the table and you've got a Challenger space shuttle. So Michael, you look like you've got something particular on this one.
Actually, Bets, the Challenger Space Shuttle, have to speak that slowly, is I think actually has one of the greatest relevances to corporate governance that any significant American tragedy has ever had. I have used the space program as the basis for a number of my articles. My children say, would you get that we're not in 1970 anymore, Dad, move on. But I think that if you look back, the Challenger example is just the best possible example of something that I think Maribess raised. And when we're talking about functional fluency, I think it's the issue of the courage of the director. We in terms of the actual qualification, it has been very disappointing to me, but illuminating that at this point in my career, I'm seeing more instances of directors sitting on their hands and allowing imperial CEOs, bullying CEOs to move forward, and they're afraid to stand up and say, no, I don't think that's the way we should go. Or where the CEO is clearly drowning out the voice of the compliance officer, the general counsel. Board members sit back and say, pause, say, wait a minute, look, can we hear that person out here? I think damage is being done because of that, where board members are not serving in their role of saying, hold on, I'm not sure if I totally understand what's going on, but we need to ask more questions. At this constructive skepticism, and the law expects the board members and constituents expect the board members to do that. So I would say that one of the most important functional fluencies of a director is the ability to demonstrate courage and conviction. That's their job, and it's not getting done enough. And again, going back to this upcoming anniversary, maybe there'll be enough public discourse on what happened 20 years ago to say, oh yeah, that's what I'm on this board for. It's not to arrange a golf date with the guy sitting next to me. It's to actually raise a voice when I see a yellow flag or a red flag.
That is absolutely true. Well, I'm mindful of the time here and your point on asking great questions. Maribess and Ryan, before we go to questions from the audience, do you have any particular things that you'd like to highlight on dangers in the boardroom for our audience?
No, I would just say education is key. However you get educated on the industry, on the issues, onboarding, when a director comes on, one of my boards, you meet with all the division heads, you meet with the functional leaders, you understand the strategic plan, you understand the direction, and that you have to commit to that education and constantly being curious and staying on top of things, just like we've talked today. So I applaud everyone out there just listening in. So
thank you, Ryan.
And I would just add, to Michael's point about having the courage to question. You often run into people don't want to be confrontational. They you have to maintain a good relationship among all these people. And so what I generally tell people who ask is I think the job of an independent director is to be professionally stupid. And what I mean by that is, instead of, if you're not comfortable saying, I disagree with this, which is confrontation, say, I don't understand, right? This doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand. Please explain to me and get me to understand and get me to accept the rationale. Because I think the board's fundamental purpose is to make company decision-making more objective than it would be if one person were making the decision. That's the reason, I think you have a group of people at the top, is to bring that objectivity. And so the best way to do that is to keep asking questions until you're satisfied that you understand the rationale for what's being done.
That's perfect. Well, I would just say thank you to all three of you. And this is a perfect segue, Stephanie, to the great questions that our virtual audience will have. So Stephanie, I'll hand over to you, and just to let everybody else know the questions that we aren't able to get to on screen, we'll follow up with some Q&A to all of you. So Stephanie?
Great. We do have several questions. The first one is, with the rise in workers agreeing to unionize, does that change the emphasis of the board in regards to this stakeholder group?
I would just say, yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead, Michael.
I think it's a good question in the sense that this is something Brian, you and I have talked about before. One of the most significant changes in board duties over the last couple of years has been the obligation to exercise oversight of workforce culture. I think the NACD has written a lot about this, and it's a responsibility that reflects this dynamic. Directors, it is a responsibility of directors. What's the welfare, health, interest of our workforce? That what leads them to unionization? What are the concerns? Keeping an open eye, and it's an area of conflict because the CEO has a reasonable belief saying that's my turf. I think that we're in an area where that's again a rebalancing of saying no, the board has a stake in that too, as it relates to not just safety and return to work and things of that nature, but the interest. And we're seeing that so much today in states where management and boards are leading corporations into exercising a social voice because they feel that's what their employees are asking them to do. So I think it's a very legitimate question, and it goes right to a new emerging board duty.
All right, our next question is, with the additional requirements being placed on boards, will companies lower the number of boards their independent board members are allowed to serve?
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely, and they're already doing it. And we're seeing it coming from the investment management firms. It's directors should want to, going back to Beth, some of your points, directors should want to tool that down. Their responsibility, as Ryan and Maribess are saying, is not only to understand their job, to do it and commit the time. Harder and harder to say that if you're on 5, 6, 7 boards, you can do it.
And it also helps with the increased need for diversity on boards, right? If you have one, the same few people serving on half a dozen boards, it's harder to get that diversity. If people have to limit themselves, you start having to find new people and get some new blood in the system. And so I think it serves multiple functions.
Brian, you and I have talked about this, but what was in the conference board a couple of years ago said the single greatest non-meeting committee challenge is turnover, and making room for the board, making room for new directors and diverse directors. And Maribess, I know you've got to struggle with that as a nominating committee chair. How do you increase turnover? How do you increase refreshment on the board?
Yeah, people have to go off and different people come on because there is a finite number of seats on the board. So definitely.
Well, and I would just
that's
say
one of
what's
the-
interesting to me, I'd spoken with a company over the last 2 years who's undergone significant change. And one of the things that they highlighted is that the pace and the scale of the change that many companies have gone through over the last 2 years should absolutely trigger questions around board refreshment and board skills. Because if the company has the same strategy that they had 2 years ago, something's wrong with this picture.
Well, and again, the benefit of having a board of multiple people is you can have turnover that isn't nearly as disruptive as a CEO turnover. It's you can maintain some institutional memory, bring in some new people, and slowly sort of rotate people off and things like that, and you get the change without the disruption necessarily. It's one of the benefits, but again, unfortunately, you often have the opposite of that, where you have a group of people who like each other and want to stick around and stick around for decades on boards.
Ryan, there's a concept that I love in governance called offboarding, and as we've seen it written, it's the basic concept that you're not a director for life, and you don't go ahead. You shouldn't have an expectation. You're there as long as you're useful, and if you're not useful, you should expect to be booted. That's a less than a pleasant or platonic concept of board service, but I think it's a reality, and people need to go into it. You can be replaced if you don't. If I'm a fellow board member and I'm looking at somebody who's not able to do the job or not holding up their end of the stick, I want that person out because they affect my liability, and I don't want to be in a deposition just trying to describe why my board broke down because a couple of people weren't effective.
Well, and the flip side of, too much, overload and experience is not enough experience. One board I serve on where I'm the only board member that has multiple boards, and people are saying, well, how do y'all do it? How do you do it over here? What do you?
Yeah.
So I think, there's a balance there.
Okay, and here's another question that ties to this as well. Do the panelists have any concerns for diversity on boards as well as gender parity on boards as a result of a California judge this month overturning that state's diversity on board mandate?
Bets, I think I can just toss a little bit out there, and I would say one thing, it's a very sensitive topic. As most folks know, there were two statutes that are out there in California, one with gender diversity and one with respect to underrepresented persons. The underrepresented persons statute was declared unconstitutional, but both statutes were challenged right out of the box. I would say, I don't know that if the Secretary of State of California has decided to appeal the decision, but the broader issue is, with all our emphasis on diversity, I think it's reasonable to tell boards to stop and look at that case and understand the grounds that the judge decided. It was an equal protection argument. There is an element of, I wouldn't say, is it truth, is it fairness, whatever. There's some intellectual perspective there that we need to understand. And ultimately, boards can't look to state mandates, I think, to drive diversity. It has to come from within the board. But I would encourage boards to understand, have their general counsel summarize that opinion, because it's telegraphing the way their own diversity initiatives might be challenged in the future.
I would just say, though, there will always be outliers. And I think the investors have embraced diversity. And so I don't, having a law to require it, I think is not going to set us back. I don't think it'll set back the push to diversify coming from the investors.
And I actually hear the discussion getting bigger, that instead of the discussion just narrowly focusing on some particular attributes, that boards are having much more robust discussion on cognitive and experiential diversity, so that they're challenging themselves not just to find someone who looks a little different than they do, but someone who thinks a little different than they do, and that's a very powerful thing.
Bets, I would also encourage boards, though, to be more aggressive in taking bold steps to enforce diversity. I think if you take an example from the sports world, from about a month and a half ago, an extraordinary event occurred when the head coach of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers resigned or he knew he only had 1 or 2 years left. He resigned in favor of one of his coaches, who was my time is in place in the NFL to get you there. And again, those are the kinds of individual leadership decisions that will ultimately promote diversity better than any statute could.
All right, thank you. And here's another one. As we move forward in 2022 to 2024, do you see shifts in boards' involvement in management of the talent strategy, meaning talent pipeline, labor market shifts, et cetera, versus the traditional succession planning overview at the VP and C-suite level?
So if
and then here's a second component to that question. What new questions or discussions are they asking of their CEOs and CHROs?
I think, this really goes to something that Maribess alluded to at the very beginning, which is you can't think really in functional silos. And that's true at the board level. I think that's also true at the senior management level. Because if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's really that there are huge interdependencies across the functional organizations within a company, and that having somebody who understands how all of those pieces come together is increasingly critical. So I think we'll see much less talent development strictly within a function, and much more of executives looking across what the business capabilities are that these folks represent that will help us on the diversity and the functional fluency axes as well. Because I think if these conversations are lifted up, and this is what I hear from talent leaders that I know who are working in the business, is that they're starting to have those conversations very differently than in the silos. What are you all hearing?
I would just say, from my experience, this is another example of a kind of a readjustment of the board management dynamic. As the Great Resignation increasingly applies to members of the executive team who are basically saying, I'm out of here. Corporations are finding themselves in a significant talent morass and gaps in leadership. It's the board has an increasing again, rub management the wrong way. And I'd be interested in Mary Bess's thoughts, especially on this. How do you respond? The CEO says, they work for me. It's my call. It's
well, one thing that we do on two of the boards I sit on is annually we have a succession planning session, and it's the matrix, and it starts with all the direct reports of the CEO, and it's really interesting. They go through we have them go through a process of talking about not just successors, but what they're looking for out of that team. And so it broadens the discussion to expertise, and it blurs the lines really between the various functions. So it's tied in with strategy. So not just today, but it's strategically where we're going. What do we need in way of succession? Because if it's a new direction, you may not have that, on your org chart. And so is someone going to be developed? And one CEO starts developing, and the day they hire a top executive and challenges that person to develop a team that could replace them. And so it's, I think it's embraced by the CEOs that I'm involved with. It's embraced because it gives them insight into the deeper the team. And then, that second tier does it as well. So it's a good exercise. I learned more from that succession planning exercise about who does what and how people are thinking. So that's one way to do it. It's valuable. But the CHRO, I think, is playing a bigger and bigger role, and that's only going to expand.
I would just add that I think, with the 20th anniversary of Sarbanes-Oxley, one of the outcomes or one of the consequences of Sarbanes-Oxley, and I'm not convinced it was a necessarily very wholly good one, is the banishment of inside directors from the board. You used to have a handful of inside directors, other executives besides the CEO sitting on boards. And since Sarbanes-Oxley, that has decreased dramatically to now, like, maybe you have one other than the CEO. And usually that is part of a very kind of an in-process succession plan where you have the heir apparent sort of spending a year on the board before the turnover. And I think that may be something that gets reconsidered because, at the end of the day, you're always going to have, I would imagine we're always going to have a majority of the board be independent from now on. And I think that's the way it should be. But inside directorships can be a very effective way for the board to get to know who's next in line, who's potential successors, and get a better sense of what's going on in the company, not relying entirely on the CEO for their information, or at least as the primary channel of information. So I think that might be an interesting direction that boards can consider as the labor market for executive talent tightens.
Well, and many,
your point. On that.
Yeah.
Not so sure I agree.
Yeah, it's interesting because many of the institutional investors have come out and will tell us that if you have a board member that's been there 15 or 20 years, they are not independent in their view. And so it just adds to that discussion about long-term board members as well. And, if you're there that long, you've bought in to to what's going on. So it's maybe difficult to have a fresh approach.
Well, and
I would just say,
there's-
I think we're needing to chase the time here. We've got like a minute to go, and probably Suzanne or Stephanie has a little housekeeping. Ryan, did you have a quick one here that I cut you off on?
I'll just say there is research out there suggesting that when the CEO is the only insider on the board, there's actually creates governance problems. Like CEO compensation goes up and things like that because the board is overly reliant on them. But that'll be the next webinar.
That's the next webinar. All right. Suzanne is on mute still.
Yes, so thank you all very much. Thank you to our moderator, Bess, as well as our panelists. I do know that we have a survey that we want to get you all. It is listed here, and we would very much appreciate you jumping right onto that chat and going through the Qualtrics survey for us. We're interested in knowing what topics are of most interest to you, and so that we can continue to keep you educated on corporate governance and boardroom issues. We don't want you to have danger in your boardroom, if at all possible.
And I would just say thank you to all of our panelists, sending you some material that both Ryan and Michael have published. And we're excited to see you in the future
Thank
at
you.
TCU Board events.
Yes, thank you all very much.
Thanks.